refer to as a disease that is actually called poliomyelitis. This first clinical description of polio was given in 1789 by Michael Underwood. The first polio epidemic is believed to have been in 1894 in Vermont. There are 132 documented cases of what were believed to be polio. A major polio epidemic hit New York in 1916 with more than 9,000 cases and 2,343 deaths. Unfortunately, it appeared that polio ravaged children in the area at a rate much higher than adults. Polio is a very interesting disease that has different effects on different people. What is interesting is that in almost 90% of polio cases, the patient doesn't actually have any symptoms at all.
Thank you, Caroline. It was discovered in the 1930s that there were 3 different types of polio. The first type of polio is abortive polio. In this type, the only real symptoms are fever, fatigue, headache, sore throat, nausea, and diarrhea. The second type of polio is non-paralytic polio. In this type, the symptoms are the same as abortive polio, but the patient will also experience neck stiffness and sensitivity to light. The third type of polio is paralytic polio. This is the type of polio where the patient will experience muscle spasms and will have suppressed reflexes. And then paralysis will soon follow after for this type of polio. Interestingly, fewer than 2% of all people with this type of polio will become paralyzed. And even then, the majority of these people will make a full recovery. Polio killed people when the chest became paralyzed and wouldn't allow breathing to occur. Fortunately, in 1928, scientists created a machine called the iron lung. And the iron lung was designed to help people breathe that had paralytic polio. This was not very effective, but was the only real means of treatment until the polio vaccine was created in 1955. This vaccine was followed up by the creation of the oral vaccine in the early 1960s. In 2015, polio had almost been entirely eradicated. It only remains endemic to Pakistan and Afghanistan.
The OPV is the oral, live attenuated polio vaccine. This vaccine could be taken orally. This is also referred to as the Sabin vaccine because it was developed by Albert Sabin. From 1965 to 2000, the Sabin vaccine was the primary vaccine used in the U.S. In 1960, the U.S. Surgeon General recommended licensing the Sabin vaccine. By 1968, the Salk vaccine was no longer being administered. As early as 1962, there was growing suspicion that the Sabin vaccine caused paralytic poliomyelitis. From 1961 to 1964, 57 cases of paralytic poliomyelitis were linked to the Sabin vaccine. The risk-reward had to be measured. By 1970, the Sabin vaccine was predominantly being used worldwide due to its low cost and long-term efficacy.
The oral vaccination should have been discontinued earlier during the polio epidemic in North America and the Middle East. It is very likely that this could have saved more lives in the process. Although it's possible that the oral vaccination did save some lives, we do not believe that these occurrences are representative of the whole population of North America and the Middle East.
The vaccine-associated paralytic poliomyelitis burden, or the VAP burden, is primarily focused in low-income countries due to the fact that they haven't switched to the IPV yet. There's approximately 4.7 cases per million births, leading to a global burden of 498 cases. The planned universal introduction of the IPV is expected to decrease the global VAP burden by 90%.
The IPV vaccination has a high success rate and has been implemented worldwide. One of the issues that we still face with the IPV vaccination is primarily in countries that are religiously Muslim. Even today, there is a stigma and superstition that the polio vaccination is just a ploy for the Americans to be able to sterilize the Muslim population. In order for a fully effective IPV polio vaccination, it is important that we can try to decrease superstitions that are clouding the eradication of polio.
Even though it is very possible that the OPV may have caused other people to get the polio virus, but evidence has shown that that may have not been the case because the oral vaccination also acted as a deterrent for the disease, thus saving some lives. In August 1960, the U.S. Surgeon General recommended licensing the Sabin vaccine, which was the oral vaccine that gave prescribed individuals a long-lasting immunity. The Global Poliomyelitis Eradication Initiative was established in 1988 to do research about polio and vaccines that could be effective treatment options. This initiative found that the oral vaccination did put people at a slightly higher risk to contract polio, but in some cases, the oral vaccination worked better than the others administered.
But Caroline, it's not true that the OPV virus only put people at a slightly higher risk of polio. Although the OPV did manage to save the lives of some individuals, it most certainly put those same individuals at a much higher risk than if they would have used the IPV polio vaccine in the first place. Studies primarily from the industrialized countries reported that individuals with immunodeficiency disorders and those receiving their first dose of OPV were at a highest risk to contract vaccine-associated paralytic poliomyelitis. This ranged from 13% to 55% in the US Belarus. In the few cases where the OPV might have had a better outcome than the IPV, there are many more studies and factors that contribute to the overall effectiveness of a vaccine. Q describes the development of OPV in the late 1950s. It was observed that a number of variables influenced efficacy of a vaccine, including the ages of infants, the amount of passively acquired maternal antibody, the season of year, the geographic locale, and the number of doses administered. Nathanson and Q tell us about a phenomenon called interference. This was recognized in these early studies. When OPV is administered to children who are concurrently infected with other enteroviruses, the proportion of vaccines who become OPV infected and develop an immune response against poliovirus is reduced. Done.
The effectiveness of the OPV vaccine can be seen through many studies and research. Vaccine-associated paralytic poliomyelitis is linked to the OPV vaccine, and the percentages of people with immunodeficiency disorders who contracted polio from the vaccine is surprisingly high. Income plays a role in the risk of contracting polio. There was a high presence of individuals with polio who lived in impoverished and poor areas. The poor, lower class, obviously had no access to the polio treatment, which made their susceptibility a lot higher than those less fortunate.
High-income countries have made the switch to the IPV vaccine, and the numbers of those contracting polio are much lower. Lower-income countries, on the other hand, are still using the OPV vaccine, and they have a higher risk of contracting polio for that. The Global Poliomyelitis Eradication Initiative wrote that the oral vaccine did put patients at a higher risk of polio than other methods. In a study in Nigeria, the OPV vaccine was shown to only provide 16 to 18% protection against polio.
Based off all the data presented, we believe that the IPV polio vaccine is vastly superior to that of the OPV or oral polio vaccine. The OPV virus was not only less effective than the IPV virus, the OPV virus has also been susceptible to encouraging the development of enteroviruses, especially in children. We believe that the complete eradication of the OPV vaccine would lead to a major decrease in impoverished countries that are still living with the burden of endemic polio.